"Do not eat that steak." The man froze with his fork halfway to his mouth. The words had not been spoken out loud. They were written in neat, careful handwriting on a small folded note that had appeared beneath his plate without anyone noticing. For a moment, the entire restaurant seemed to go silent around him. The low hum of conversation, the clink of silverware against porcelain, the soft jazz drifting from hidden speakers all faded into the background as Daniel Whitmore stared at the message. He had walked into the place 10 minutes earlier looking like someone who had no business sitting at a table that cost more than most people spend on groceries in a week. His coat was worn. His boots carried the dust of the street. The host had hesitated before seating him. The manager had frowned openly, but the young woman who served him had not hesitated at all. She had simply nodded, poured water into his glass, and treated him like every other customer. And now, somehow, she had slipped a warning onto his table. Before continuing, comment where in the world you are watching from and make sure to subscribe because tomorrow's story is one you cannot miss. Daniel Whitmore lowered the fork slowly and leaned back in his chair. Around him the steakhouse glittered with polished wood and amber light. The room smelled of butter, grilled beef, and expensive wine. A group of men in tailored suits laughed loudly at a nearby table. A couple near the window studied a wine list that probably cost more than the monthly rent of the apartment Daniel had pretended to live in for the past week. No one in the room recognized him. That was exactly the point. Daniel Whitmore was a billionaire who owned one of the largest hospitality companies in the country. Yet tonight, he sat alone in a crowded steakhouse wearing the disguise of an ordinary man. For months, he had been quietly visiting restaurants across his own chain without revealing who he was. He wanted to see the truth, not the polished performance employees showed executives during scheduled inspections, but the real version that ordinary customers experienced every day. And tonight something felt wrong. His eyes drifted toward the woman who had served him. Naomi Carter moved between tables with steady, calm movements, balancing a tray on one hand while refilling glasses with the other. She looked no older than 26. Her dark hair was tied neatly behind her head. Her uniform was spotless despite the rush of the dinner crowd. What caught Daniel's attention most was her expression. She did not look nervous. She did not look apologetic. She looked certain, as if she knew exactly what she had just done. Daniel picked up the note again and read it a second time. "Do not eat that steak." A faint sound drifted from the open doorway that led toward the kitchen. Someone inside laughed loudly. Another voice muttered something sharp and irritated. Daniel's eyes narrowed slightly. Across the room, the restaurant manager, Rick Dalton, stood near the bar watching the dining room like a hawk guarding its territory. His gaze briefly passed over Daniel with the same dismissive look he had shown when the poorly dressed man first walked in. Then his attention shifted back to wealthier-looking guests. But Naomi Carter noticed everything. As she passed Daniel's table again, she did not look directly at him. She simply slowed for half a second and whispered so quietly that only he could hear it. "Trust the note." Then she kept walking as if nothing unusual had happened at all. Daniel Whitmore stared down at the untouched steak in front of him. Steam rose gently from the perfectly seared ribeye. The smell was rich and tempting. Yet suddenly the meal looked less like dinner and more like a test. And something told him that the young waitress who had slipped him that warning might be the only honest person in the entire building. Daniel Whitmore kept his eyes on the steak for several seconds without touching it. The heat from the plate drifted upward in thin waves that shimmered beneath the warm lights of the dining room. Anyone watching from another table would have seen nothing unusual. A man studying his food. A quiet dinner in a crowded restaurant. But Daniel felt a shift in the air that most people would never notice. Something beneath the polished surface of the place felt wrong. The smell of grilled meat and butter suddenly seemed heavier. The laughter at nearby tables sounded forced, and the note resting beside his plate carried more weight than the ribeye in front of him. "Do not eat that steak." He folded the paper slowly and slipped it into the inside pocket of his coat. Across the room, Naomi Carter moved between tables with smooth, calm efficiency. She refilled a glass of iced tea at one table, cleared plates at another, and nodded politely when a couple thanked her for their meal. No one watching her would suspect that she had just warned a stranger about something serious. She worked like someone who had learned to survive inside a place where speaking openly could cost her everything. Daniel lifted the steak knife and pressed the tip gently against the meat. The surface was perfectly seared. The grill marks were even. Everything about the dish looked exactly the way a steakhouse advertisement would promise. Yet he did not cut into it. Instead, he glanced toward the open doorway that led into the kitchen. For a brief moment, the door swung wider as a cook pushed through carrying a tray of plates. Daniel caught a quick glimpse inside. Stainless steel counters gleamed under bright white lights. Flames jumped from a grill at the back wall. Two cooks moved quickly in front of it, turning steaks and shouting short instructions over the noise of sizzling meat. Nothing about the scene looked unusual at first glance. But then Daniel noticed something small. A man near the prep station grabbed a raw steak from a plastic container and placed it on the grill without looking at the label on the container beside it. The label had a date printed on it that Daniel could not read from across the room. Still, something about the way the cook handled the container felt careless. The kitchen door swung, closed again. Daniel leaned back in his chair and watched the dining room with quiet patience. A man who had built a business empire did not do it by ignoring instincts. His instincts told him Naomi Carter had not written that note as a joke. A few moments later, she passed his table again, carrying a tray with 3 empty glasses balanced neatly across her hand. This time she stopped just long enough to place a fresh napkin beside his plate. Her voice was barely louder than a breath. "I meant what I wrote." Daniel looked up at her. Her expression remained calm, but her eyes held a seriousness that did not match the relaxed atmosphere of the dining room. "Why warn me?" he asked quietly. Naomi did not answer right away. Instead, she glanced toward the bar, where Rick Dalton stood speaking with the host. The manager laughed at something the host said, but the laugh sounded sharp and impatient. Naomi lowered her voice even further. "Because you look like someone who would not be able to afford the hospital bill if something went wrong." The words landed heavier than she intended. Daniel raised an eyebrow slightly. Naomi seemed to realize what she had implied and shook her head once. "I did not mean it like that," she said softly. "I only meant some people here do not care who gets sick as long as the plates keep moving." Daniel followed her glance toward the kitchen door again. From where he sat, he could see Rick Dalton now walking toward the back hallway that led to the kitchen. The manager pushed through the door and disappeared inside. Naomi straightened and lifted the empty tray slightly higher against her hip. Her voice dropped to almost nothing. "Just trust me. Do not eat it." Then she walked away toward another table where a family had just been seated. Daniel Whitmore watched her go. The steak in front of him continued to steam gently under the warm lights. Across the dining room, the door to the kitchen swung open again. For a moment, Daniel saw Rick Dalton inside, speaking sharply to one of the cooks. The cook pointed toward a stack of plastic containers near the prep station. Rick grabbed one of the labels and ripped it off with a quick, angry motion before tossing it into a trash bin. The door closed again. Daniel Whitmore slowly set the steak knife down beside his plate. The warning note in his pocket suddenly felt less like a precaution and more like the beginning of a much larger problem. Daniel Whitmore remained seated long after the kitchen door closed again. The image he had just seen stayed fixed in his mind. The manager tearing a label from a container. The quick, angry motion. The way the cook had looked around before continuing his work. Small details like that were easy to miss for most customers enjoying a meal. But Daniel had spent years building restaurants across the country. He knew exactly how a professional kitchen should operate. And that moment had not looked professional. It had looked like someone trying to hide something. The steak in front of him continued to cool slowly on the plate. A thin line of juice had begun to gather along the edge of the meat, sliding toward the white porcelain rim. A couple seated 2 tables away laughed loudly as a waiter poured them a second bottle of wine. Another table nearby debated whether to order dessert. Everything around Daniel continued as if nothing was wrong. Yet the small folded note in his coat pocket reminded him that one person in the building had already seen what others refused to notice. Naomi Carter returned to the service station near the back wall and began polishing silverware with a clean cloth. Her movements were steady, almost automatic. Anyone watching would assume she had done this work 1,000 times. In truth, she had. 6 nights every week. 12-hour shifts when the weekend crowds filled the dining room. She had learned to move quickly without drawing attention. Learned to listen without appearing to listen. Learned that sometimes the most important thing in a restaurant was not what customers said out loud, but what staff members whispered when they thought no one important was nearby. Daniel rose slowly from his chair and carried his plate toward the service station instead of leaving it on the table. Naomi looked up with quiet surprise when he approached. Most customers never brought their own dishes back. He set the plate down gently on the counter beside her stack of polished forks. "I think you saved me from a bad decision tonight," he said quietly. Naomi glanced at the untouched steak. Then she looked around the room to make sure no one else was paying attention. "I only did what I thought was right," she replied. Daniel studied her expression. There was no arrogance there. No pride in being correct. Only the calm seriousness of someone who had chosen honesty, even though honesty might cost her something later. "How long have you worked here?" Daniel asked. Naomi folded the cloth carefully before answering. "Almost 3 years. Long enough to know when something is wrong." Daniel nodded slowly. "And tonight something is wrong." Naomi did not respond right away. Instead, she picked up the plate and slid it beneath the counter where dirty dishes waited to be carried back to the kitchen. Her voice dropped to a whisper. The meat delivery arrived. "This afternoon." Usually the supplier sends fresh cuts packed in sealed containers with temperature tags on the labels. Today, some of those containers were different. Daniel listened closely. Different how he asked. Naomi leaned slightly closer, so her voice would not carry across the room. The smell was off when the cooks opened the first box. One of them said the meat might have warmed up during transport. Rick told them to keep cooking anyway. Daniel felt his jaw tighten slightly. "And you saw this happen?" Naomi nodded once. "I saw the label on one container. The date was 2 days earlier than it should have been." Daniel glanced again toward the kitchen door. Inside that room, dozens of meals were being prepared for guests who trusted the restaurant to protect their health. "Did you tell anyone outside the kitchen?" he asked. Naomi shook her head. Rick said if anyone mentioned it, the whole shift would be sent home without pay. A silence passed between them. Around them, the restaurant continued its busy rhythm of laughter and clinking glasses. Naomi finally looked Daniel directly in the eyes. "I know you probably think it is not my problem," she said quietly. "But if someone eats at steak tonight and gets sick, I would still feel responsible." Daniel Whitmore studied the young waitress standing in front of him. Most people in that dining room had more money than Naomi Carter would earn in years of working double shifts. Yet at this moment, she was the only person in the building who had chosen to protect strangers instead of protecting her own paycheck. Daniel gave a small, thoughtful nod. "You did the right thing, Naomi." She looked uncertain for the first time all evening. "I hope so," she said softly. "Because if Rick finds out, I warned you my job will disappear before this dinner rush is over." Daniel glanced down at the service counter where the discarded steak now rested among the empty plates. Then he looked back at Naomi Carter. Something told him the real story of this restaurant was only beginning to reveal itself. Daniel Whitmore remained beside the service counter for several seconds after Naomi Carter finished speaking. The sounds of the dining room continued around them like nothing had changed. A group near the front windows burst into laughter. A waiter hurried past carrying a tray of drinks. That rattled softly with each step. The warm, golden lights above the tables reflected off polished glasses and dark wood surfaces, creating the comfortable illusion of a perfect evening. But Daniel no longer saw the restaurant the way the other customers did. He saw a system that depended on trust. And tonight, that trust had already been broken. Naomi lifted another stack of silverware and began polishing the forks one by one. Her hands moved quickly, but Daniel could see a faint tension in the way her fingers pressed the cloth against the metal. She was thinking about what she had just told him, thinking about the risk she had taken. Daniel spoke quietly, so no one nearby would hear. "Has anyone else noticed what you noticed tonight?" Naomi shook her head without looking up. "Some of the cooks probably know, but most of them do not want to ask questions. When a manager tells people to keep working, they usually keep working." Daniel nodded slowly. He understood that kind of pressure. A kitchen during the dinner rush could feel like a battlefield. Orders coming in faster than they could be prepared. Heat pouring from the grill. Supervisors shouting instructions. In that kind of environment, many people stop questioning things they should question. But Daniel Whitmore had built his entire career on the opposite principle. Details mattered. Accountability mattered. And honesty mattered more than anything else. Naomi finally set the polished forks into a tray and looked toward the kitchen door again. Her voice lowered. I should get back to my tables. If Rick sees us talking this long, he will start asking questions. Daniel stepped aside so she could move past him. Before she walked away, he spoke again. Naomi. She paused. If you had not warned me, I would have eaten that steak without thinking twice. Naomi gave a small, uncertain smile. I am glad you did not. She turned and returned to the dining room floor, greeting a new table with the same calm professionalism she had shown all evening. Daniel watched her for a moment before returning to his seat. The plate in front of him had been cleared, leaving only a folded napkin and a glass of water with melting ice. He sat quietly and observed the room. Across the dining area, a waiter delivered another steak to a table of 3 businessmen. The men began cutting into their meals immediately while continuing a conversation about investments and travel plans. None of them suspected anything was wrong. Daniel felt a slow weight settle in his chest. He had spent years building a company that promised quality and trust to every guest who walked through its doors. Restaurants carried his standards, his reputation. Yet tonight, one of those restaurants might be serving food that could harm the very people it was supposed to serve. A shadow moved across the table as someone approached. Daniel looked up to see Rick Dalton standing beside him. The manager wore a tight, polite smile that did not reach his eyes. Everything all right here, sir? He asked. Daniel studied the man for a moment before answering. The steak was not quite what I expected. Rick glanced briefly toward the service counter where the empty plate had been taken away. His smile stiffened slightly. I apologize for that. If there's a problem with your order, I can have the kitchen prepare another one right away. Daniel leaned back in his chair and folded his hands calmly. That will not be necessary. Rick nodded, though a flicker of irritation passed across his face. Very well, sir. If you need anything else, please let us know. As the manager turned to leave, Daniel noticed something else. A faint smear of red across the cuff of Rick Dalton's shirt sleeve. It could have been steak juice from the kitchen, or it could have been something less harmless. Daniel watched the man walk back toward the bar, where he resumed overseeing the dining room like a guard watching over his territory. At that moment, Daniel Whitmore made a quiet decision. Tonight was no longer just about a steak he refused to eat. It was about understanding exactly what kind of leadership had allowed this restaurant to reach the point where a waitress felt the need to secretly warn a stranger. And before the night ended, Daniel intended to see the truth for himself. Daniel Whitmore remained seated long after Rick Dalton walked away. The manager returned to the bar area and began speaking with the host again, occasionally glancing across the dining room as if checking that every table was producing revenue. The restaurant looked successful from the outside. Every table was filled. The air carried the rich smell of grilled beef and butter. Wine glasses reflected the amber lights above the bar. Anyone walking in from the street would believe they had entered one of the finest steak houses in the city. Yet, Daniel now understood that appearances could hide serious problems beneath the surface. Naomi Carter moved quickly between tables, balancing a tray of drinks in one hand while answering questions from a couple studying the menu. She never looked toward Daniel again, but he could sense that she remained aware of everything happening around the room. A waitress who had survived 3 years in a place like this learned how to read the entire floor without turning her head. Daniel lifted his water glass and took a slow sip. The ice had almost completely melted, leaving the drink lukewarm. He set the glass down and watched another waiter deliver 2 more steaks to a nearby table. The guests cut into their food immediately, smiling as they tasted the first bites. Daniel felt a quiet unease settle deeper inside him. If Naomi was right about the meat shipment earlier that day, then those plates carried a risk none of the customers understood. And the man responsible for making that decision was currently standing at the bar pretending everything was under control. The kitchen door swung open again, and a busboy hurried out carrying a heavy plastic tub filled with dirty dishes. The young man looked no older than 19. He moved quickly toward the service station where Naomi was organizing silverware. Daniel watched as Naomi spoke to him for a moment. The busboy nodded nervously and returned to the kitchen without saying another word. A few seconds later, Naomi walked back across the dining room toward Daniel's table, carrying a small tray with a single cup of coffee. She set the cup down gently in front of him, even though he had not ordered it. "On the house," she said quietly. Daniel looked up at her. "Why?" Naomi kept her voice calm. "Because if someone is going to sit here without eating anything all night, they might as well have something warm to drink." Daniel allowed himself a faint smile. "You are assuming I plan to stay a while." Naomi met his eyes briefly. "I am assuming you are trying to understand what is happening here." Daniel stirred the coffee slowly with a spoon. The dark surface rippled under the light. "You noticed that?" Naomi shrugged slightly. "People who come here for dinner do not watch the kitchen door every few minutes." Daniel leaned forward slightly. "Then tell me something honestly, Naomi. Do you believe the meat being served tonight could make someone sick?" Naomi did not answer immediately. Instead, she glanced once more toward the kitchen door and then toward Rick Dalton at the bar. Her voice dropped to a careful whisper. "I believe the risk is real." Daniel studied her face for a moment. Most employees in that position would avoid answering such a direct question. Naomi Carter did not. She spoke the truth, even though that truth could threaten her job. Daniel placed the spoon down beside the coffee cup. "You said the shipment arrived this afternoon." Naomi nodded. "Around 3 o'clock. Some boxes looked fine, but a few were warm when the cooks opened them. Rick told them to cook everything anyway because the dinner rush was already building." Daniel felt his mind begin to connect the details. Warm containers, old labels, a manager removing evidence. Everything pointed toward the same conclusion. Someone in that kitchen had decided that profit mattered more than safety. Naomi lifted the empty tray from Daniel's table. "I should get back to work before Rick notices I have been standing here too long," she said softly. Daniel nodded once. "Thank you for the coffee, Naomi." She gave a small, tired smile. "You are welcome." As she walked away, Daniel Whitmore looked again toward the kitchen door, where another tray of steaks was being carried into the dining room. The quiet decision he had made earlier began to take clearer shape in his mind. Tonight, he would not leave this restaurant until he understood exactly how far the problem inside that kitchen truly went. Daniel Whitmore sat quietly with the untouched cup of coffee warming his hands while the dinner rush continued around him. The restaurant had grown louder as the evening deepened. Plates clattered gently in the kitchen. Waiters moved quickly between crowded tables. The air carried the heavy scent of seared beef, garlic butter, and red wine. To every other guest in the room, it felt like a successful night. But Daniel now watched the place with a different kind of attention. Each tray leaving the kitchen, each plate placed in front of customer. Each moment the manager glanced toward the dining floor. The system was revealing itself piece by piece. Naomi Carter passed by his table again, this time carrying a tray with 3 fresh steaks. The sizzling sound still echoed faintly from the hot plates. She delivered them to a table of businessmen who immediately began eating while continuing a loud conversation about real estate deals. Daniel noticed the brief pause in Naomi's movements as she watched them take the first bites. It lasted only a second before she forced herself to continue working. That single moment told him everything he needed to know about the pressure she was carrying. She had done what she could to warn one person, but the rest of the dining room still trusted the kitchen completely. Daniel lifted the coffee cup and took a slow sip. The bitterness grounded his thoughts. He had built his hospitality company with a simple belief that every guest deserved safety and respect no matter how much money they spent. The moment that belief disappeared, a restaurant became nothing more than a trap disguised as comfort. The kitchen door opened again, and 2 cooks stepped out arguing quietly with one another. Their voices were low but tense. Daniel could not hear the exact words, yet the tone carried frustration. One of them shook his head and gestured back toward the kitchen as if insisting something should not be happening. The other cook glanced toward Rick Dalton at the bar and lowered his voice immediately. The conversation ended there. The cooks returned to the kitchen. Daniel set the coffee cup down slowly. Something in that exchange confirmed what Naomi had suspected earlier. The decision to keep serving the questionable meat had not been accepted quietly by everyone. Some of the staff clearly understood the risk, but felt powerless to stop it. Across the dining room, Rick Dalton continued monitoring the floor with the confidence of someone who believed he controlled the entire operation. Every few minutes, he checked the kitchen door and then scanned the tables to make sure guests looked satisfied. His smile appeared whenever someone caught his eye, but the smile vanished as soon as he turned away. Daniel recognized that type of leadership. It was the kind that valued appearance more than truth. Naomi returned to the service station again and began stacking clean plates beside the counter. Daniel watched her for a moment before, rising from his chair and walking over. She noticed him immediately and spoke without looking up. "You're still here," she said quietly. Daniel nodded. "I told you I plan to understand what is happening tonight." Naomi placed the last plate into the stack and leaned slightly closer so their conversation would not carry across the room. "Then you probably saw the cooks arguing a moment ago." Daniel nodded again. "They do not agree with Rick's decision." Naomi sighed softly. "One of them tried to call the supplier earlier. Rick stopped him and said if anyone contacted the supplier during the shift, they would be fired before the night ended." Daniel felt his jaw tighten slightly. The pattern was becoming clear. Control the staff. Remove evidence. Keep the food moving. Naomi glanced around again before continuing. "There is something else," she said quietly. Daniel waited. Naomi lowered her voice even further. "The health inspector usually visits restaurants in this district sometime during the week. Rick heard a rumor this afternoon that an inspection might happen tonight or tomorrow morning." Daniel studied her expression, and he still chose to serve the shipment anyway. Naomi nodded slowly. "He said if the inspector comes, we will deal with it then. For now, the goal is to finish the dinner rush without losing money." Daniel looked across the dining room again. Dozens of guests were enjoying their meals under warm lights, completely unaware of the quiet tension running through the staff. The situation had moved beyond a simple mistake. It had become a test of character. Daniel Whitmore understood something in that moment with complete clarity. Naomi Carter had chosen integrity even when she believed she had no power. Rick Dalton had chosen profit even when he held all the authority in the room. Daniel folded his hands calmly on the service counter and looked at Naomi. "Tonight is not over yet," he said quietly. Naomi studied his face with cautious curiosity. "What do you mean?" Daniel gave a small, thoughtful nod toward the kitchen door. "I mean, the truth has a way of walking into a room when people least expect it, and something tells me that moment is getting closer with every minute that passes." The tension in the restaurant grew thicker with every passing minute, although most of the customers never noticed it. Daniel Whitmore returned slowly to his table after, speaking with Naomi Carter, carrying the quiet certainty that the situation inside the kitchen was moving towards something unavoidable. The warm lights above the dining room continued to glow softly across polished wood tables and expensive wine glasses. Laughter drifted through the air from a birthday celebration near the windows. A couple at the bar leaned toward each other in quiet conversation. Everything looked comfortable and ordinary. Yet Daniel now understood that the calm surface of the evening hid a dangerous decision that had already been made hours earlier. He sat down and folded his hands calmly on the table while watching the kitchen door. The rhythm of the restaurant continued without pause. Servers moved quickly between tables carrying trays of food. Plates of steak and roasted potatoes appeared one after another across the dining floor. Daniel noticed that some of the cooks inside the kitchen were working faster now, almost nervously, as if they wanted to finish the dinner rush before something interrupted it. A few minutes later, Naomi Carter approached another table near Daniel's seat where a family had just been served their meals. The father cut into his steak and nodded with approval before continuing his conversation. Naomi smiled politely, but Daniel saw the faint shadow in her expression as she walked away from the table. She could not warn everyone. She could only watch and hope that nothing went wrong. Daniel lifted the coffee cup again, but did not drink. His attention remained fixed on the kitchen door. That was when something unexpected happened. The front entrance of the restaurant opened, and two unfamiliar figures stepped inside. They were not dressed like ordinary customers. One was a middle-aged woman wearing a dark jacket and holding a small clipboard. The other was a tall man carrying a slim black case in one hand. Both of them paused just inside the doorway and scanned the dining room carefully before walking toward the host stand. Daniel felt a quiet sense of confirmation settle inside him. Naomi had been right about the rumor earlier. The health inspection had arrived sooner than anyone expected. At the bar, Rick Dalton noticed the visitors almost immediately. His confident posture stiffened for half a second before he forced a wide, welcoming smile across his face. He walked quickly toward the front of the restaurant and extended his hand. "Good evening," he said loudly, enough for nearby guests to hear. "Welcome to Whitmore Grill. How may we help you tonight?" The woman with the clipboard returned a polite nod, but did not shake his hand. "We are here for a routine health inspection," she replied calmly. The words seemed ordinary, but Daniel saw the immediate reaction ripple through the staff. One of the cooks inside the kitchen froze in the middle of plating a steak. Another cook looked toward the door with wide eyes before quickly turning back to the grill. The busboy who had been stacking plates suddenly moved faster than before, clearing dishes from the service counter as if the extra movement might hide something. Naomi Carter stood near the service station when she heard the words routine health inspection. Her eyes lifted toward the entrance, and for a moment Daniel saw a mixture of relief and fear cross her face. Relief because the truth might finally come into the open. Fear because Rick Dalton would immediately start looking for someone to blame. Rick maintained his polite smile while guiding the two inspectors toward the back hallway that led to the kitchen. "Of course," he said smoothly. "We take cleanliness and safety very seriously here. You're welcome to inspect anything you need." The woman made a brief note on her clipboard before speaking again. "We will begin with the kitchen and food storage areas." Rick nodded and led them toward the swinging kitchen doors. As they disappeared into the back hallway, a subtle silence passed through the staff. Everyone understood that the next few minutes could change the entire night. Daniel Whitmore leaned back slowly in his chair and watched the kitchen door close behind the inspectors. The truth that had been hidden earlier in the evening was now walking directly into the room where it had been concealed. Across the dining room, Naomi Carter glanced once toward Daniel. She did not smile. She did not speak. But the look in her eyes said everything. The moment of reckoning had finally arrived. The kitchen doors had barely finished swinging closed behind the health inspectors when the energy inside the restaurant shifted in a way that only the staff could truly feel. From the dining room, the evening still looked perfectly normal. Guests continued cutting into their steaks. Glasses clinked softly as wine was poured. Conversations drifted through the warm air beneath. The amber lights. But behind that calm surface, a wave of quiet tension spread through the employees like a ripple moving across water. Daniel Whitmore remained seated at his table, watching everything with careful attention. His posture looked relaxed, but his mind followed every movement around the room. Naomi Carter stood near the service station with a stack of clean plates in her hands, yet she was not placing them down. Her eyes remained fixed on the kitchen door where the inspectors had disappeared with Rick Dalton only moments earlier. The seconds stretched longer than usual. Finally, the door swung open again. One of the inspectors stepped halfway into the dining room while speaking calmly to Rick Dalton behind her. Daniel could not hear the exact words, but he saw the change in Rick's face immediately. The confident smile he had worn earlier was gone. In its place appeared a tight, controlled expression that tried to hide the rising pressure behind his eyes. The inspector asked one of the cooks to bring several containers from the walk-in refrigerator. Rick forced a short nod and signaled toward the kitchen staff. The door closed again. Naomi slowly placed the stack of plates on the counter and exhaled quietly. Daniel noticed the movement and walked toward the service station once more. "It has begun," he said softly. Naomi nodded without looking up. "If the inspectors check the meat containers, they will see the same labels I saw earlier." Daniel leaned slightly closer. "And Rick knows that." Naomi finally met his eyes. That is why he is nervous. They both turned toward the kitchen door again. A few moments later, another cook stepped out carrying a large plastic container filled with raw steak sealed in clear wrapping. The cook walked past the dining room quickly and disappeared into a small side hallway where the inspectors were waiting. The entire exchange lasted only seconds, but Daniel noticed something important. The cook's hands were trembling slightly. Across the room, Rick Dalton returned to the bar area and picked up a glass of water. He drank it quickly before setting the glass down harder than necessary. The sound caught the attention of the host standing beside him. Rick lowered his voice and spoke sharply to the young man before walking back toward the kitchen. Naomi watched the scene carefully. He is trying to stay ahead of. Then she whispered. Daniel folded his arms calmly. It may already be too late for that. Naomi looked uncertain. What do you mean? Daniel kept his voice low. Inspectors do not ask for containers unless something inside the kitchen already raised questions. Naomi absorbed the thought quietly. A faint sound echoed from the hallway behind the kitchen. The sound of a refrigerator door opening. Then the muffled voices of the inspectors discussing something among themselves. One of the cooks suddenly pushed through the kitchen door again and hurried across the dining room, carrying another container. This time Rick Dalton followed closely behind him. Rick stopped halfway across the room and spoke to Naomi in a controlled but tense tone. Naomi, I need you to clear the service station and bring fresh trays to the back hallway immediately. Naomi hesitated for only a fraction of a second before nodding. Yes, sir. She lifted the trays from the counter and moved toward the hallway where the inspectors were working. As she passed Daniel's table, she spoke without turning her head. They found something. Daniel watched her disappear through the hallway doorway. Across the restaurant, several customers continued eating their meals, completely unaware that the kitchen was now under scrutiny. The warm lights still glowed softly above their tables. The music still played quietly through the speakers. Yet Daniel Whitmore understood that the balance of the entire evening had already shifted. The truth Naomi had tried to protect was now moving through the hands of people whose job was to expose it. And somewhere behind that kitchen door, Rick Dalton was running out of ways to keep the problem hidden. The minutes that followed felt strangely suspended between two different worlds. In the dining room, the evening continued almost normally. Guests laughed at private jokes. A server uncorked another bottle of wine. A birthday candle flickered gently on a small dessert near the window. Yet just beyond the kitchen doors, a very different reality was unfolding. Daniel Whitmore remained seated where he could clearly see both the service hallway and the main dining floor. His coffee had gone completely cold, but he no longer noticed it. His attention stayed fixed on the narrow hallway where Naomi Carter had disappeared carrying the trays. Every few seconds, a muffled voice drifted from the back area where the inspectors were working. The voices were calm but firm, the kind of tone used when people were documenting something serious. After several long minutes, the kitchen door swung open again, and Naomi stepped back into the dining room. She was moving carefully, but Daniel immediately noticed the tension in her shoulders. She returned to the service station and placed the empty trays on the counter before slowly wiping her hands on a clean cloth. Daniel rose from his chair and approached her quietly. What do they find? He asked. Naomi lowered her voice so no nearby guest could hear. They checked the refrigerator first. Daniel watched her closely. And Naomi exhaled softly. The inspectors asked Rick why several containers were missing temperature tags. Rick said the labels must have fallen off during delivery. Daniel raised an eyebrow slightly. That explanation sounded convenient. Naomi nodded once, but the inspectors did not accept it immediately. They opened the containers and checked the meat inside. Daniel leaned closer. Naomi glanced toward the hallway again before continuing. One of the inspectors noticed the smell right away. The meat was not spoiled yet, but it was clearly past the safe storage window. Daniel felt a quiet confirmation settle in his chest. Exactly what he had suspected earlier. Naomi continued speaking in a careful whisper. Rick tried to argue that the meat was still safe if it was cooked at a high enough temperature. The inspector told him that was not how food safety worked. A brief silence passed between them. Around them, the dining room still looked peaceful. A waiter delivered another plate of roasted vegetables to a nearby table. A couple at the bar asked for another round of drinks. None of them realized that the kitchen had just been caught serving questionable food. Daniel spoke again. Did the inspectors stop the service? Naomi shook her head. Not yet. They said they needed to document everything first and check the storage records before making a decision. Daniel nodded slowly. That was standard procedure. The inspectors would gather evidence carefully before taking action that could shut down the restaurant. Naomi glanced toward Rick Dalton, who had just stepped out of the hallway again. His expression had changed noticeably. The smooth confidence he had shown earlier was gone. Now he moved through the dining room with forced calm, speaking quietly to the host and two of the waiters as if giving instructions. Naomi watched him for a moment before speaking again. I think he's trying to control the situation before the inspectors come back out here. Daniel folded his arms thoughtfully. What kind of instructions? Naomi shook her head slightly. I cannot hear everything, but I caught one part. Daniel waited. Naomi's voice dropped even lower. He told the cooks to keep serving the tables that already placed orders. Daniel looked toward the dining room again. That meant dozens of steaks were still leaving the kitchen even after the inspectors had raised concerns. The decision spoke clearly about Rick Dalton's priorities. Naomi noticed the same realization forming on Daniel's face. That is why I warned you earlier, she said softly. If the inspectors had arrived later, those steaks might have gone out all night. Daniel studied Naomi Carter for a long moment. The courage it took for a waitress to challenge a decision like that was not small. Most people in her position would have stayed silent and protected their job. Naomi had chosen something different. Across the room, Rick Dalton suddenly looked toward the service station, and his eyes locked briefly with Naomi's. The moment lasted only a second, but it carried enough suspicion to make Naomi stiffen slightly. Daniel noticed it immediately. He leaned closer to her and spoke quietly. Be careful. Naomi nodded slowly. I know. Rick turned away again and walked back toward the hallway where the inspectors were finishing their documentation. Daniel Whitmore remained standing beside the service counter, watching the entire room with growing clarity. The truth about the meat shipment had now been confirmed by the inspectors. But the night was far from over. In fact, the most important moment of the evening had not happened yet. Because soon those inspectors would step back into the dining room and ask a question that Rick Dalton would struggle to answer. And when that moment arrived, the quiet decision Daniel Whitmore had made earlier would finally begin to reveal who he truly was. The hallway door opened again, and this time both health inspectors stepped fully back into the dining room. Their expressions were calm but firm, the kind of expression people wore when they had already reached a conclusion and were simply preparing to explain it. Conversations around the restaurant continued for a few seconds longer, but the staff noticed the change immediately. Naomi Carter straightened slightly at the service station. One of the cooks paused halfway through plating another steak. Even the young host near the entrance stopped speaking in the middle of a sentence. Rick Dalton followed the inspectors out of the hallway, forcing a tight smile that looked more like strain than hospitality. The woman holding the clipboard spoke first in a clear professional voice. Mr. Dalton, we need to address several issues regarding the storage and handling of your meat shipment that arrived earlier today. Rick nodded quickly as if he had expected the conversation. Of course, he said. If there was any misunderstanding, I am sure we can clear it up. The inspector did not return the smile. We documented multiple containers of beef that exceeded the safe storage window and were missing proper temperature verification tags. Several of those containers were already opened and used during service. A faint murmur spread through the nearby tables as a few guests began to notice the unusual conversation taking place near the center of the dining room. Rick lowered his voice slightly. I believe there has been a mistake. The shipment arrived late, and some labels may have been damaged during transport. The meat itself is still safe if cooked properly. The second inspector, the tall man carrying the black case, shook his head slowly. That is not how food safety regulations work. When temperature verification cannot be confirmed, the product must be discarded. Rick's smile faded another degree. Discarding the entire shipment would create a significant loss for the restaurant. The woman with the clipboard responded calmly. Public health is not measured against profit. Daniel Whitmore listened from his table without interrupting. Around him, several guests had stopped eating entirely and were now watching the exchange. Naomi Carter remained near the service station, her hands resting quietly against the counter while her eyes moved between Rick and the inspectors. The tension that had been building all evening had finally stepped into the open. Rick glanced briefly toward the dining room, as if realizing that the conversation had gained an audience. Then his gaze shifted toward the staff. His eyes landed on Naomi for a fraction of a second before returning to the inspectors. "We have served hundreds of meals tonight, without a single complaint," he said firmly. The inspector answered with the same calm tone. "The absence of complaints does not change the evidence we observed in your kitchen." The tall inspector opened his case and removed a small folder containing several forms. "Based on what we documented, this restaurant must temporarily halt service while we complete a full safety review of the food storage areas." That sentence landed like a quiet shock across the room. One of the waiters froze in place, holding a tray of drinks. A customer near the bar whispered something to his wife. Naomi Carter lowered her eyes for a moment, as if absorbing the weight of what was about to happen. Rick Dalton stepped closer to the inspectors, his voice tightening. "You cannot shut down service during peak hours without further testing." The woman with the clipboard met his stare without hesitation. "We can, and we will if there is a risk to public health." A long silence settled across the dining room. Then Rick did something that revealed more about his character than any inspection report ever could. He turned sharply toward the staff and pointed toward Naomi Carter. "She was the one asking questions about the shipment earlier," he said loudly. "Perhaps she misunderstood something in the kitchen and started unnecessary concern." Naomi lifted her head slowly, surprise flashing across her face. Daniel Whitmore felt the moment shift instantly. Rick Dalton was looking for someone to blame, someone with the least power in the room. Several guests turned to look at Naomi now, unsure what was happening. The inspectors exchanged a brief glance. Naomi spoke quietly but clearly. "I did not misunderstand anything she said. I only noticed the labels on the containers were different from the usual deliveries." Rick responded immediately, his voice sharper now. "And instead of reporting it properly, you chose to create panic during a busy dinner service." Daniel Whitmore stood up from his chair at that exact moment. His voice remained calm, but carried clearly across the room. "That is not what happened here." Every head in the dining room turned toward him. Rick frowned slightly as he recognized the poorly dressed customer who had ordered the steak earlier. "And you were?" he asked impatiently. Daniel Whitmore reached calmly into his coat pocket with a folded note from Naomi, still rested. He held it for a moment before answering. "Someone who listened when the only honest person in this building tried to warn me." The dining room fell into a strange silence after Daniel Whitmore spoke. Conversations that had filled the air moments earlier faded into uneasy whispers. Guests looked from the inspectors to Rick Dalton, and then toward the quiet man who had just stood up from a table where an untouched steak had grown cold. Rick frowned as he studied Daniel more closely, clearly annoyed that a customer had stepped into the middle of a conversation he was trying to control. "Sir, this is a private matter between management and the inspection department," Rick said sharply. "I suggest you return to your table and allow us to handle it professionally." Daniel did not move. Instead, he held up the small folded note that Naomi Carter had slipped beneath his plate earlier that evening. The paper was simple and unremarkable, yet in that moment it carried more truth than every explanation Rick Dalton had attempted to give. Daniel unfolded it slowly so the inspectors could see the handwriting. "This was placed under my plate before my meal was served," he said calmly. "The message told me not to eat the steak that came out of your kitchen tonight." A quiet ripple passed through the dining room. Several guests leaned forward in their chairs. The woman holding the clipboard stepped closer and studied the note carefully. She looked at Naomi, then back at Daniel. "You are saying this employee warned you before the inspection began?" Daniel nodded. She did not know inspectors were coming. She only knew something was wrong and chose to protect a stranger instead of protecting her job. Rick's voice tightened immediately. "That is an exaggeration. Employees sometimes misunderstand kitchen procedures." The inspector raised a hand slightly, stopping him from continuing. We will decide what is exaggeration and what is evidence, she said firmly. She turned toward Naomi Carter. Miss Carter, did you write this note? Naomi hesitated for a fraction of a second. Her eyes moved briefly across the room, where Rick Dalton stood watching her with growing frustration. Then she looked back at the inspector. Yes, ma'am, she answered quietly. The inspector nodded once. Why did you feel the need to warn a guest? Naomi's voice remained steady, even though every employee in the room was now watching her. Because I saw containers of meat in the refrigerator that were warmer than they should have been, and some labels were missing. When the cooks asked about it, they were told to keep serving the food anyway. Rick stepped forward again, anger creeping into his tone. That is not an accurate description of what happened. Daniel spoke again before the argument could continue. Then perhaps you should explain why the labels were removed from the containers entirely. Rick turned toward him sharply. And how exactly would you know anything about our storage containers? Daniel met his stare calmly. Because I saw you tear one of those labels off yourself. The words landed heavily in the center of the room. Rick opened his mouth to respond, but no immediate answer came. The inspectors exchanged another glance. The tall inspector wrote something quickly on his form before speaking again. Mr. Dalton, we will need to review your shipment records and the remaining storage containers immediately. Rick's frustration was now impossible to hide. This entire situation is being blown out of proportion because of one misunderstanding and one overly dramatic employee. Daniel stepped forward another pace, his voice still calm, but carrying a weight that demanded attention. No, this situation exists because one employee chose integrity while a manager chose profit. Naomi looked toward Daniel with quiet surprise. Until that moment, she had assumed he was simply a concerned customer who happened to believe her warning. She did not yet understand the full reason he had stayed in the restaurant long after his meal was served. The woman with the clipboard closed her folder slowly and turned toward Rick Dalton. For the moment, all food service in this establishment is suspended while we complete our review. Rick's shoulders stiffened as he realized the decision was final. Then the inspector turned toward Daniel once more. Sir, thank you for bringing the note forward. May we have your name for our report? Daniel Whitmore reached calmly into his coat pocket again, but this time he removed a small leather card holder instead of the folded note. He opened it and handed a business card to the inspector. The room grew very still as she read the name printed across the top of the card. Daniel Whitmore, founder and chief executive officer of Whitmore Hospitality Group. For a long moment, no one in the dining room spoke. The name printed on the card seemed to freeze the entire restaurant in place. The woman holding the clipboard looked down at the business card again, then back at the man standing calmly in front of her. The tall inspector beside her leaned slightly closer and read the name over her shoulder. The realization spread across his face first, followed quickly by a subtle shift in his posture. Around them, the guests who had been watching the exchange began whispering to each other. Some recognized the name immediately. Others simply sensed that something important had just been revealed. Rick Dalton did not move at first. His eyes stayed locked on the card in the inspector's hand, as if he hoped he had read it incorrectly. Then his expression drained of color. Mr. Whitmore, he said slowly, the confidence that had filled his voice earlier, now completely gone. Daniel Whitmore slipped the leather card holder back into his coat pocket and met Rick's gaze without anger or raised emotion. Yes, he answered quietly. I founded this company 20 years ago with the belief that every guest who walks into one of our restaurants deserves honesty and safety. Rick opened his mouth as if searching for the right response, but no words came. Daniel continued speaking, his voice calm, but impossible to ignore. Tonight, I walked into this restaurant dressed like someone who might not belong here. I ordered a steak and watched how the staff treated me. Most of the evening, I was invisible to you. But one person in this room chose to see me as a guest worth protecting. He turned slightly and nodded toward Naomi Carter, who still stood near the service station, her hands resting quietly against the counter as she tried to process what was happening. Daniel continued. She did not know who I was. She only knew something was wrong, and she chose integrity instead of silence. The inspector holding the clipboard made another note before speaking. Mr. Whitmore, we will still complete our review according to regulation, but your testimony confirms several concerns we already documented. Daniel nodded respectfully. I understand, and I support that process completely. Then he turned back toward Rick Dalton. You, on the other hand, chose to remove labels from containers and continue serving food you knew could not be verified as safe. Rick took a small step backward, as if the weight of the accusation had physically pushed him. I can explain, he began quickly. The delivery arrived late, and the dinner rush was already starting. I believe the meat could still be used if it was cooked properly. Daniel raised one hand gently, stopping the explanation. The problem is not that the delivery arrived late. The problem is that when faced with a difficult decision, you chose profit over responsibility. The words settled heavily across the room. Several guests quietly pushed their plates away from the table as the reality of the situation became clear. The tall inspector closed his case and spoke firmly. Mr. Dalton, based on our findings, the kitchen will remain closed until all questionable products are removed and the storage systems are inspected again. Rick lowered his eyes. Yes, sir, he muttered. Daniel remained standing beside the inspectors. There's another decision that needs to be made tonight, he said. Rick looked up slowly, already sensing what was coming. Daniel Whitmore spoke without raising his voice. As of this moment, you're relieved of your position as manager of this location. The restaurant will remain closed until a full review is completed and new leadership is placed here. Rick's shoulders sagged as if the strength had drained from them completely. Around the room, the staff stood quietly, unsure how to react. Daniel then turned back toward Naomi Carter. For a second, she looked almost ready to apologize for causing trouble. Instead, Daniel offered a small, respectful nod. Miss Carter, tonight you demonstrated the kind of judgment and integrity this company was built on. Naomi blinked in surprise, still struggling to understand the full meaning of what had happened. Daniel Whitmore allowed a faint smile to appear for the first time that evening. Tomorrow morning, I would like you to meet with our regional director. I believe someone with your honesty deserves the opportunity to help lead this restaurant forward. The dining room remained unusually quiet even after the inspectors finished documenting the final details of their report. Some guests had already stood up from their tables, speaking softly among themselves as they prepared to leave. Others stayed seated for a moment longer, still absorbing what had unfolded in front of them. The warm lights above the tables continued to glow, but the atmosphere of the restaurant had changed completely. What had begun as an ordinary evening had turned into a lesson about responsibility that no one in the room would forget. Daniel Whitmore stood calmly beside the inspectors, while the final instructions were given to the staff. The questionable containers of meat were removed from the kitchen and sealed for disposal. Several cooks began cleaning the preparation counters under the careful supervision of the inspectors. The sound of running water and clattering trays echoed faintly through the hallway as the kitchen was gradually shut down for the night. Rick Dalton stood near the bar with his shoulders lowered and his eyes fixed on the floor. The authority he had carried earlier that evening had vanished completely. One of the inspectors approached him and quietly explained the formal steps that would follow the inspection report. Rick nodded once without speaking. Across the dining room, Naomi Carter remained near the service station, watching everything with a mixture of disbelief and relief. Only a short time earlier, she had believed she might lose her job simply for asking questions about shipment. Now the entire direction of the restaurant had changed because she refused to stay silent. Daniel Whitmore walked slowly across the dining room toward her. When he stopped beside the service station, Naomi looked up, still unsure how to respond to the man who had revealed himself to be the owner of the entire company. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The room around them had grown quiet as the remaining guests gathered their coats and moved toward the exit. Finally, Naomi broke the silence. I only wrote the note because it felt wrong to serve that food, she said softly. I never expected any of this to happen. Daniel gave a small, thoughtful nod. That is exactly why it matters, he replied. Integrity does not usually announce itself with big speeches. Most of the time, it appears in small decisions when no one is watching. Naomi looked down at the service counter for a moment before meeting his eyes again. I was afraid you would think I was causing trouble. Daniel shook his head gently. The truth is the opposite. Tonight you protected the reputation of this restaurant more than anyone else in the building. He glanced briefly around the dining room, where the last few guests were stepping out into the cool night air beyond the glass doors. Then he looked back at Naomi Carter. A business can survive a bad shipment, he continued. What it cannot survive is losing the courage to do what is right. Naomi let out a quiet breath she did not realize she had been holding. The weight of the evening seemed to lift from her shoulders. Daniel Whitmore extended his hand toward her in a simple, respectful gesture. Tomorrow we start fixing what went wrong here, he said calmly. And I would like you to help us do that. Naomi hesitated for only a moment before shaking his hand. Thank you, she said quietly. Daniel offered a small smile before turning toward the exit where the inspectors were finishing their paperwork. As he stepped outside into the cool evening air, he paused for a moment and looked back through the glass windows of the restaurant. Inside, the lights were beginning to dim as the staff finished closing procedures. The night had not changed the entire world, but it had changed one place and one future. Because a waitress who had no power chose honesty over silence. And that single decision reminded everyone in the room what real leadership actually looked like.